April 11, 1945, 3:27 p.m. Buchenwald concentration camp, Weimar, Germany. American soldiers from the 6th Armored Division pushed through the camp gates, rifles raised, expecting resistance. What they found instead silenced them. Emaciated figures stumbled forward, skeletal hands reaching out, eyes hollow from starvation and disease. The smell hit next. Rotting flesh, human waste, and burning hair from the crematorium oven still warm from their final use. Private First Class Warren E. Priest, a medic with the 120th Evacuation Hospital, was among the first medical personnel to enter. He carried a stethoscope with a single grim mission: determine who had a heartbeat worth saving. Walking through the barracks, Priest found prisoners dying at his feet, collapsing mid-step as their bodies finally surrendered. Those with detectable heartbeats were rushed to makeshift aid stations. Those without were left where they fell for burial. In Block 46, American investigators discovered something different. This was not a barracks for slave labor or starvation. It was a medical experimentation block. Inside, they found surgical tables, vivisection instruments, and meticulously maintained logbooks documenting experiments on healthy prisoners. Phosphorus burns to test medications, deliberate typhus infections to observe disease progression, and systematic mutilations conducted without anesthesia. The SS doctors had fled hours earlier. Their white coats were left behind, stained with blood that told stories their mouths never would. 3 days later, on April 12th, legendary CBS journalist Edward R. Murrow arrived at Buchenwald. He walked among survivors who praised President Franklin Roosevelt, unaware that the president had died that very morning. Murrow entered a barracks that once housed horses, but now held men from Czechoslovakia, so weak they wished to lift him onto their shoulders in gratitude, but lacked the strength to do so. Before leaving, Murrow counted the names of 242 people who had died in that single barracks over the past month. His broadcast to America 3 days later, on April 15th, carried a stark warning about its extreme content. Murrow's voice cracked as he described what he witnessed, but even his words failed to capture the full scope of the medical horrors documented inside Block 46. At the same time, 280 miles south, another discovery was unfolding. April 29, 1945. Dachau concentration camp, Bavaria, Germany. The U.S. 45th Infantry Division and elements of the 42nd Infantry Division converged on Dachau, liberating over 30,000 prisoners. Combat medics like Private Priest, who had just stabilized Buchenwald, were immediately reassigned. Priest recalled seeing the same horror replayed, walking skeletons dropping dead at his feet. He carried his stethoscope again, searching for heartbeats among the dying. At the children's section of Dachau, known as the Little Camp, Priest found rows of small bodies, already dead from disease and starvation. As he turned to leave, he saw movement. A little girl curled in a fetal position. He grabbed her and ran toward the aid station, desperate to save at least one life. Halfway there, she died in his arms. From that moment, Priest later recalled, every heartbeat found became a small piece of hope in an ocean of despair. But Dachau held secrets darker than starvation. In the camp's medical buildings, American investigators discovered something that would reshape medical ethics forever. Filing cabinets full of meticulous reports documented experiments conducted by SS Hauptsturmführer, Dr. Zygmunt Rascher, and his colleagues. The documents detailed high-altitude simulation experiments, where prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers until their lungs collapsed and they died screaming. Hypothermia experiments submerged naked prisoners in ice water for hours, recording their body temperatures as they descended toward death. Coagulation experiments required fresh blood samples, so Rascher simply shot prisoners in the abdomen and collected vials as they bled out. Other reports described saltwater experiments, where prisoners were forced to drink only seawater for days until they went mad from dehydration. Nerve gas experiments exposed prisoners to mustard gas and phosgene. Wound experiments involved gashing open prisoners' legs, then grinding wood fragments, glass, and bacteria into the wounds to simulate battlefield injuries, all to test sulfa drugs and other treatments. Each report was signed, dated, and stamped with official SS approval. The American soldiers who discovered these documents could barely comprehend what they were reading. This was not the chaotic brutality of combat. This was systematic, bureaucratic, scientifically documented torture masquerading as medical research. But the doctors were gone. Rascher himself had been executed by the SS in 1945 for fraud and other crimes unrelated to his experiments, a convenient erasure of one of their most prolific medical murderers. Others had vanished into the chaos of Germany's collapse, blending into the refugee columns streaming across Europe. At field headquarters, Allied military officers reviewed the initial reports with growing unease. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal framework was non-existent. International law had no provisions for prosecuting doctors who experimented on prisoners. Under Nazi law, the experiments were technically legal. Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, and other prisoners had been stripped of all legal protections, including those governing medical research, which in Germany at the time protected animals like dogs, horses, and monkeys, but not concentration camp inmates. Defense arguments were already being whispered. The prisoners were sentenced to death anyway. The experiments served the war effort, and no international code prohibited such research. In London, the Allied command faced a decision. They could prosecute the doctors for murder, but that would reduce the crimes to mere wartime atrocities no different from battlefield executions. Or they could attempt something unprecedented. Create a legal and ethical framework that defined the boundaries between medicine and barbarism, and hold the Nazi doctors accountable for crossing them. On June 1, 1945, a 40-year-old neurologist and psychiatrist was summoned to Allied headquarters. His name was Dr. Leo Alexander. Born in Austria to a Jewish family, he had fled the rise of Nazism and immigrated to the United States, where he practiced medicine in Boston. Now, the U.S. military needed his expertise for an entirely different purpose: investigating Nazi medical war crimes. Alexander was given a single directive: go to Dachau, examine everything, and compile a full report. He arrived at Dachau in early June 1945, stepping into the same medical buildings where American liberators had discovered Rascher's filing cabinets weeks earlier. Alexander opened the first folder. Inside were photographs of prisoners submerged in ice water tanks, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies shivering violently as SS doctors in white coats stood beside them, stopwatches in hand, clipboards ready, calmly recording the time until unconsciousness and death. Alexander opened another folder. Detailed tables showed rectal temperatures dropping degree by degree. 97 degrees, 93 degrees, 89 degrees, 85 degrees, 81 degrees, 77 degrees, then death. Next to each temperature reading was a timestamp and a brief observation. Subject unconscious, subject convulsing, subject deceased. He read Rascher's correspondence with Reichsfuhrer SS Heinrich Himmler, requesting permission to expand the experiments. Himmler's response was enthusiastic, praising the research and granting full authorization. Alexander worked through the night, photographing documents, copying tables, and cataloging the evidence. By July 10, 1945, he had produced a 228-page report on Rascher and the hypothermia experiments alone. Over the following months, he expanded his investigation, ultimately producing 1,500 pages of reports documenting the full scope of Nazi medical crimes at Dachau and other camps. His reports were sent to Allied prosecutors preparing for war crimes trials. The evidence was irrefutable: signed approvals, detailed protocols, photographs, and victim testimony from the few who survived. But Alexander knew that evidence alone would not be enough. The Nazi doctors would argue that no law prohibited their experiments, that the research served a greater good, and that the prisoners were going to die anyway. To convict them, the Allies would need to establish a new ethical standard, one that defined what medicine must never become. Even at the height of documentation and discovery, as Alexander pored over the horrors meticulously archived by the SS, a question haunted every investigator, every prosecutor, and every witness who bore testimony to the crimes hidden within those sterile white rooms. What separates a healer from a torturer, and who draws that line? Though the principles that would later crystallize into the Nuremberg Code did not yet exist on paper, in the summer of 1945, the moral urgency behind them was already forming in the minds of those who saw the evidence firsthand. The world did not yet know it, but the foundation of modern medical ethics was being laid one document, one photograph, one victim's name at a time. And when the trials came, that foundation would be tested against the most monstrous defense the medical profession had ever mounted, that science without humanity was still science, and that the law had nothing to say about it. June 18, 1945. Allied Document Center, Heidelberg, Germany. Leo Alexander sat hunched over a table piled high with manila folders, his eyes burning from exhaustion and the dim light filtering through the bombed-out windows. Around him, Army intelligence officers cataloged the greatest archival find of the war. 847 sealed crates containing Heinrich Himmler's personal files, discovered 2 weeks earlier in a damp Austrian cave where the SS had tried to hide them before the Reich's collapse. American Captain James Taylor walked over and dropped another box on Alexander's desk. Inside, a plain manila folder stamped case number 707. Alexander broke the seal and opened it. The first page was a typed letter dated February 17, 1942, from SS Hauptsturmführer Dr. Zygmunt Rascher to Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Rascher's tone was obsequious, almost giddy. The letter read, Reichsführer, I have the honor to report that experiments on human tolerance to extreme cold are now proceeding with excellent results at Dachau. The subjects are exposed to temperatures as low as 36 degrees Fahrenheit in ice water tanks for durations of up to 3 hours. So far, 280 to 300 persons have been experimented upon, with 90 to 100 deaths recorded. I respectfully request authorization to expand the program and include additional rewarming methods, including the use of animal warmth from female subjects. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he turned the page. Himmler's response, written in his signature green pencil, was enthusiastic. Approved. The experiments are of the greatest importance to the war effort and the health of our soldiers. Continue with all necessary measures. Heil Hitler. Alexander stood abruptly and called out to Taylor. You need to see this. Taylor walked over and read the documents in silence, his jaw tightening. Finally, he looked up. This is signed approval for mass murder disguised as science. Alexander nodded. And if Rascher was asking for permission in February 1942, that means the program started even earlier. We need everything on him. Everything. Over the next 6 days, Alexander worked without pause, photographing every document, copying every table, cataloging every victim name that appeared in Rascher's meticulous logs. What emerged was not the isolated work of a sadistic rogue, but a systematic, bureaucratically sanctioned program involving dozens of SS doctors, Air Force physicians, and research assistants, all working under official Reich approval. One folder contained photographs, naked prisoners submerged in ice water tanks, their faces contorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. SS doctors in pristine white coats stood beside the tanks, stopwatches in hand, clipboards ready, calmly recording the time until unconsciousness and death. Another folder contained temperature logs, rectal thermometer readings dropping degree by degree, 97 degree, 93 degree, 89 degree, 85 degree, 81 degree, 77 degree. Then the word deceased stamped in red ink. Next to each reading, a clinical note. Subject unconscious at 88 degree. Subject convulsing at 83 degree. Subject ceased breathing at 77 degree. Time to death, 53 minutes. A third folder contained Rascher's correspondence with colleagues, describing the victim's psychological states with detached fascination. One report noted, subjects enter the water tanks with marionette-like obedience, showing no resistance. Once submerged, however, they begin to bellow like animals. Many beg to be shot. At temperatures below 90 degrees, most lose bladder control. At 88 degrees, pupils dilate and consciousness fades. At 85 degrees, the body enters irreversible shock. Taylor returned to Alexander's desk and saw him staring at a single chart, his face pale. What is it? Alexander pointed to the document. Rascher called this Table 7. Time to death in ice water immersion naked subjects. It's the briefest and most laconic confession of 7 murders in existence. 7 human beings reduced to data points on a graph. Taylor leaned over and read the chart. After a long silence, he said quietly, We're going to make sure the world sees this. Every word, every photograph, every number. But Alexander knew documentation alone would not be enough. The Nazi doctors had left nothing to chance. They had followed German law, obtained official approvals, and documented everything with scientific precision. Under Nazi legal code, Jews, Poles, Soviet POWs, and concentration camp inmates had been stripped of all protections that German law afforded to animals like dogs, horses, and monkeys. Technically, Rascher and his colleagues had committed no crime under the laws of the Third Reich. Alexander turned to Taylor and said, "They're going to argue that no international law prohibited this, that the prisoners were going to die anyway, that the research served the war effort. We need something more than evidence. We need a new standard, a line that separates medicine from murder." Taylor nodded grimly. "Then we'll create one." On July 10, 1945, Alexander delivered his first report to Allied prosecutors in London, 228 pages documenting Rascher's hypothermia experiments at Dachau. Over the following months, he expanded his investigation, producing an additional 1,272 pages covering high-altitude experiments, saltwater experiments, coagulation experiments involving shooting prisoners in the abdomen to collect blood samples, nerve gas exposures, and wound experiments where prisoners' legs were gashed open and filled with wood fragments, glass, and bacteria to simulate battle. Field injuries. Each report was the same: meticulous Nazi documentation, signed approvals from Himmler and other high-ranking SS officials, photographs, victim testimony from the few who survived, and incontrovertible proof that this was not the chaotic brutality of combat, but systematic, bureaucratically sanctioned medical torture conducted in the name of science. On November 15, 1945, Allied prosecutors convened in Nuremberg to prepare for what would become the doctor's trial. General Telford Taylor, chief prosecutor for the United States, addressed the assembled legal team. "Gentlemen, this is no mere murder trial. We are here to stamp these acts and the ideas that engendered them as barbarous and criminal. We are here as agents of the United States and as the voice of humanity." One prosecutor stood and asked, "Sir, the Germans will argue that what they did was legal under Nazi law. How do we respond?" Taylor glanced at Alexander, who sat quietly in the corner. "Dr. Alexander has prepared a memorandum outlining the ethical requirements for any medical research involving human beings. We will present this to the judges and argue that these principles reflect universal human rights that transcend any single nation's laws." Another prosecutor interjected, "And if the judges reject it?" Taylor's voice hardened. "Then we make them understand that medicine without ethics is not medicine. It is murder with a stethoscope." On December 7, 1946, 2 days before the doctor's trial officially began, Alexander submitted his memorandum to General Taylor: Ethical and Non-Ethical Experimentation on Human Beings. The document outlined 3 core requirements: moral and legal consent from the participant, Hippocratic obligation of the investigator toward the participant, and scientific validity of the research itself. The memorandum concluded, "The ultimate aim of medical research is to cure, treat, and prevent illness. Any research whose purpose is killing, which I term catanology, is not medicine. It is barbarism." Taylor read the memorandum twice, then looked up at Alexander. "This is exactly what we need. If the judges adopt even a fraction of this, we will have changed medicine forever." Alexander replied quietly, "If they don't, then Rascher and his colleagues will have won, even from their graves." December 9, 1946, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom fell silent as the 23 defendants entered, flanked by American military police. They were not common criminals. They were respected medical scientists, university professors, physicians with decades of experience, men who had taken the Hippocratic oath to do no harm. At the defense table sat Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation. Next to him, Dr. Waldemar Hoven, chief physician at Buchenwald. Further down, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, president of the German Red Cross. Dr. Joachim Rugowski, chief hygienist of the SS. Dr. Kurt Blom, deputy health leader of the Third Reich. Each had signed documents approving experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Each had documented the suffering and death of hundreds, perhaps thousands of human beings. Each sat with calm, professional detachment, as if attending a medical conference rather than a war crimes trial. General Taylor rose to deliver the opening statement. The evidence which we will submit will show that certain of the defendants were principals in, or accessories to, the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. These crimes were the direct and inevitable consequence of medical experiments without the subject's consent, performed on thousands of concentration camp prisoners. The victims of these crimes are numbered in the thousands, and many of them died or were permanently crippled. He paused and looked directly at the defendants. The defendants will argue that no law prohibited their actions. They will claim the prisoners were condemned to death anyway, that the experiment served the German war effort, and that physicians must obey the state. We will prove that such arguments are morally bankrupt and legally irrelevant. Medicine exists to heal, not to harm. Science without humanity is not progress. It is barbarism. Across the aisle, defense attorney Dr. Robert Servatius stood and responded, "The prosecution speaks of crimes, but crimes require laws. There were no international regulations governing medical research during the war. Under German law, the experiments were legal. The participants were enemy combatants and criminals sentenced to death. Their sacrifice contributed to scientific knowledge that saved German soldiers' lives. My clients acted within the law and within the customs of war." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Taylor shot to his feet. "Then we will create a law, and history will remember these proceedings as the moment humanity drew the line between medicine and murder." In the back row of the gallery, Leo Alexander sat motionless, his hands folded in his lap. He had spent 6 months uncovering the evidence, documenting the crimes, and preparing the prosecution's case. Now, as the trial unfolded, he could only watch and hope that justice, however delayed, would finally arrive. But even as the prosecutors presented mountains of evidence, signed approvals, photographs, and victim testimony, Alexander felt a gnawing doubt. What if the judges ruled that the experiments were technically legal? What if Rascher and Himmler and all the architects of this horror were vindicated by the very system they had exploited? And yet, as Alexander looked at the faces of the defendants, he saw something unexpected. Not defiance, not pride, but the first faint flickers of fear. For the first time in their careers, these men who had treated human beings as laboratory animals were being forced to confront the consequences of their actions. For the first time, they were being judged not by the laws of the Third Reich, but by the moral standards of a world that had witnessed their crimes and refused to look away. And in that moment, Alexander understood. Even if some of them escaped punishment, none of them would escape history. The American prosecutors had done something the Nazi regime never could. They had exposed the truth, preserved the evidence, and given the victims a voice that would echo across generations. The Nuremberg Code did not yet exist, but sitting in that courtroom watching American prosecutors dismantle the moral rot of Nazi medicine with precision and righteous fury, Alexander knew it was being born. One testimony, one document, one damning photograph at a time. January 15th, 1947, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom doors swung open, and 2 American military policemen escorted a small, frail woman to the witness stand. Her name was Jadwiga Dzido, a Polish Catholic resistance fighter arrested by the Gestapo in 1942 and imprisoned at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She wore a simple dress and walked with a pronounced limp. The judges leaned forward as she took her seat. American prosecutor James McHaney stood and addressed the court. "Miss Dzido, can you tell the court what happened to you at Ravensbrück?" Jadwiga's voice was steady but soft. "In August 1942, I was taken from my cell to the camp hospital. I did not know why. There were other Polish women there, all from the resistance. The SS doctors told us we were to undergo a minor procedure for the benefit of German soldiers." McHaney continued, "Did you consent to this procedure?" "No. We refused. But they held us down. They injected us with anesthesia. When I woke, my leg was bandaged and in terrible pain." "What did the doctors do to you?" "They cut open my right leg and deliberately infected the wound with bacteria, wood splinters, and glass fragments. They told us they were simulating battlefield injuries to test new sulfa drugs. For weeks I had fever, pain, and pus draining from the wound. 5 of the women in my group died. Those of us who survived were left with permanent scars. McCaney walked over to her. Miss Zito, would you please show the court your injury? Jadwiga stood, lifted the hem of her dress and revealed her right leg. Running from her knee to her ankle was a thick, jagged scar, discolored and uneven, the permanent mark of an experiment conducted without her consent, without anesthesia, and without any intention of healing her. The courtroom fell silent. Photographers captured the moment. Jadwiga standing before the judges, her scarred leg exposed, while the Nazi doctors who had ordered such experiments sat motionless at the defense table. One of them, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, president of the German Red Cross and personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, had directly supervised the Ravensbrück experiments. He stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. McCaney turned to the judges. The prosecution rests. This woman's leg is all the evidence we need. Days later, another survivor took the stand. Father Leo Michalowski, a Polish Catholic priest, had been imprisoned at Dachau and subjected to malaria experiments. Prosecutor Alexander Hardy asked, "Father, what happened to you in the malaria experiment block?" Father Michalowski's voice trembled as he recalled, "In 1942, I was taken to a hospital room. An SS doctor told me I was to receive injections for my health. I refused. He said, 'I am responsible for your life, not you.' Then the nurses held me down and injected me with malaria-infected blood. What symptoms did you experience? High fever, convulsions, terrible pain in my head and kidneys. I thought I was dying. Other priests in the block did die. I saw them carried out in the night. After the fever broke, the doctor returned and gave me another injection. The fever came back. This happened 3 times. Each time I begged them to stop. Each time they told me it was for science, for the good of German soldiers fighting in tropical climates. Did any doctor ask for your consent? Never. We were not patients. We were laboratory animals." Father Michalowski looked directly at the defendants. These men took an oath to heal. Instead, they tortured. They violated every principle of medicine and every law of God. The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. On February 14, 1947, the chief defendant, Dr. Karl Brandt, took the stand in his own defense. He was calm, articulate, and unapologetic. Defense attorney Robert Servatius asked, "Dr. Brandt, did you believe the experiments you authorized were legal?" Brandt replied without hesitation, "Yes." Under German law, concentration camp prisoners had no legal protections. They were enemies of the state, condemned to death. Using them for medical research that could save German soldiers' lives was not only legal, but morally justified. The experiments were conducted by trained physicians under controlled conditions. The data collected was scientifically valid and contributed to medical knowledge. General Telford Taylor rose for cross-examination. "Dr. Brandt, you say the experiments were legal, but were they ethical?" Brandt paused, then answered carefully. "Ethics are determined by the needs of the state. In wartime, the state's primary obligation is to protect its soldiers and citizens. Sacrificing a few condemned prisoners for the greater good is not unethical. It is necessary." Taylor's voice sharpened. "So you believe that medicine serves the state, not the patient?" Brandt nodded. "In wartime, yes. The physician's duty is to the nation, not to individual prisoners who have already forfeited their rights." Taylor walked to the evidence table and picked up a photograph. This is a picture from Dachau. A prisoner submerged in ice water screaming in agony, while SS doctors stand beside him with stopwatches, recording the time until his death. Is this what you call serving the nation? Brandt did not look at the photograph. Regrettable, but necessary. Luftwaffe pilots were dying from hypothermia after being shot down over the North Sea. The experiments provided data on how to save them. Taylor slammed the photograph onto the table. The data was worthless. Rascher's methodology was flawed, his results unreliable, and his conclusions scientifically invalid. These were not experiments. They were murder disguised as science. Brandt's composure cracked for the first time. We followed protocols. We documented everything. We acted within the law. Taylor leaned forward. Then the law was wrong. and this tribunal will say so. In the weeks that followed, the prosecution presented over 1,500 pages of evidence compiled by Leo Alexander, signed approvals from Himmler, detailed experimental protocols, photographs of victims, temperature logs recording deaths degree by degree, victim testimony, and autopsy reports. Each document was a nail in the coffin of the Nazi doctor's defense. On April 17, 1947, Alexander submitted his final memorandum to the court, Ethical and Non-Ethical Experimentation on Human Beings. The document outlined 10 principles that he argued should govern all human medical research, beginning with the requirement that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The judges took the memorandum and retired to deliberate. August 19, 1947. Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom was packed. Survivors sat in the gallery alongside American military officers, international journalists, and representatives from medical associations around the world. The judges entered, and the room fell silent. Presiding Judge Walter Beals, a former Chief Justice of the Washington State Supreme Court, addressed the defendants. The evidence presented in this trial has demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that you, the defendants, participated in experiments on human beings without their consent, resulting in the deaths of hundreds and the permanent injury of thousands. These experiments were conducted not for the benefit of the victims, but for the stated purpose of advancing German military interests. Beals paused and looked directly at Karl Brandt. The defense has argued that no law prohibited these experiments. We reject that argument. There are standards of conduct that transcend the laws of any single nation. Medicine exists to heal, not to harm. Science must serve humanity, not enslave it. These principles are universal, and their violation constitutes a crime against humanity. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Beals continued. This tribunal hereby establishes 10 principles that shall govern all future medical research involving human subjects. The first and most important is this: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. He read the remaining 9 principles aloud. Experiments must be designed to yield results for the good of society, based on prior animal studies and knowledge of disease, conducted by scientifically qualified persons, designed to avoid unnecessary suffering and injury, never conducted where death or disabling injury is expected, with risks never exceeding the humanitarian importance of the problem, and subject to termination at any time by the participant. These principles, he declared, constitute the Nuremberg Code, and they shall serve as the ethical foundation for all medical research conducted henceforth. Beals then delivered the verdicts. 7 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Karl Brandt, Karl Gebhardt, Joachim Rogowski, Waldemar Hoven, Victor Brack, Rudolf Brandt, and Wolfram Sievers. 9 defendants received prison sentences ranging from 10 years to life. 7 defendants were acquitted due to insufficient evidence of direct participation. Karl Brandt stood as his sentence was read. He showed no emotion. The man who had once been Hitler's personal physician, who had signed orders condemning thousands to death in the name of science, was now condemned himself by the very principles he had rejected. In the back of the courtroom, Leo Alexander sat motionless, tears streaming down his face. For 2 years, he had worked tirelessly to document the crimes, compile the evidence, and draft the ethical framework that would prevent such horrors from ever happening again. Now, as the verdicts were read, he knew that justice, however imperfect and delayed, had finally arrived. June 2, 1948. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria, Germany. 7 condemned Nazi doctors stood on the gallows, nooses around their necks. Karl Brandt was the first. As the trapdoor opened beneath his feet, his final words echoed through the execution chamber. I die without hatred, but the world did not accept his claim. The evidence against him and his colleagues had been too overwhelming, the suffering of their victims too profound, the betrayal of medical ethics too complete. The American prosecutors, investigators, and medical experts who had spent years bringing these men to justice had achieved something unprecedented. They had not only punished the guilty, but had created a lasting framework to protect future generations from the horrors of unethical medical research. The Nuremberg Code, born from the ashes of Nazi atrocities and forged by American determination to hold evil accountable, became the foundation for every major declaration of medical ethics that followed. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the Belmont Report in 1979, and the ethical guidelines used by every institutional review board and research ethics committee in the world today. At the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau in April 1945, American soldiers had confronted evil in its most bureaucratic and systematic form. Doctors who tortured in the name of science, who documented murder with clinical precision, and who justified atrocity as legal necessity. 3 years later, those same Americans had crushed that evil not with vengeance, but with something far more powerful: the creation of a universal ethical standard that declared for all time that science without humanity is barbarism, that consent is not optional, and that medicine exists to heal, not to harm. The Nazi SS camp doctors had believed they were beyond judgment, protected by the laws of the Third Reich and the authority of the state. America's rescue teams, investigators, prosecutors, and judges proved them catastrophically wrong, and the code they left behind ensured that no doctor, no government, and no ideology would ever again be allowed to claim that the ends justify such monstrous means. October 18, 1964. Helsinki, Finland. Helsinki. 17 years after the Nuremberg Code was written, 171 physicians and medical ethicists from 38 countries gathered at the headquarters of the World Medical Association for an extraordinary session. They had come to address a question that haunted the medical profession. What happens when governments ignore ethical standards? Dr. Donald Irvine, representing the British Medical Association, stood before the assembly. Gentlemen, the Nuremberg Code has existed for nearly 2 decades, yet we continue to see unethical research conducted in hospitals, universities, and clinics across the world. The code lacks enforcement mechanisms. It was born from the prosecution of Nazi doctors, but it does not bind physicians who were never tried at Nuremberg. An American delegate, Dr. Henry Beecher of Harvard Medical School, added his voice. In my own country, I have documented 22 examples of unethical human experimentation, published in reputable medical journals between 1960 and 1965 alone. Researchers injected cancer cells into elderly patients without consent. They withheld life-saving treatments to study disease progression. They exposed mentally disabled children to hepatitis to observe infection rates. All of this occurred after Nuremberg, after we supposedly learned the lesson. The assembly fell silent. Dr. Irvine continued, his voice firm. We must create a new declaration, one that binds all physicians regardless of nationality or legal jurisdiction. The Nuremberg Code was written by judges for courtrooms. We need a code written by physicians for physicians. Over the next 3 days, the assembly debated, revised, and finalized what would become the Declaration of Helsinki. Its opening line echoed the spirit of Nuremberg but expanded its reach. It is the mission of the physician to safeguard the health of humanity. The physician's knowledge and conscience are dedicated to the fulfillment of this mission. The declaration reaffirmed the principle of informed consent but added critical protections. Vulnerable populations, including children and the mentally incapacitated, required special safeguards. Research involving human subjects must be reviewed and approved by independent ethics committees. The interests of the individual must always take precedence over the interests of science and society. When the final vote was called, the Declaration of Helsinki was adopted unanimously. The assembled physicians stood and applauded, knowing they had taken the principles born in Nuremberg and transformed them into a universal code that would govern medical research for generations to come. But even as the declaration was being celebrated in Helsinki, another ethical crisis was unfolding across the Atlantic. July 25, 1972, Washington Post, front page. Reporter Gene Heller published an explosive story. The United States Public Health Service had been conducting a study of untreated syphilis in 399 black men in Macon County, Alabama, for 40 years. The men, most of them poor sharecroppers, had been told they were receiving free medical care for bad blood, a local term for a variety of ailments including syphilis. They were never told they had syphilis. They were never offered treatment, even after penicillin became widely available in the 1940s as a cure for the disease. Instead, researchers watched them deteriorate, documenting the progression of untreated syphilis as it caused blindness, dementia, organ failure, and death. The Tuskegee syphilis study, as it became known, violated every principle of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. No informed consent, no benefit to the subjects, deliberate withholding of life-saving treatment, and exploitation of a vulnerable population. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Senator Edward Kennedy convened emergency hearings declaring, "We have a right to know how many more such studies are taking place under the sponsorship of the federal government, and we have a right to know what is being done to protect the rights of human subjects in such research." President Richard Nixon's administration, desperate to contain the scandal, ordered the study terminated immediately and established the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. For the next 6 years, the commission worked to answer a single question: how do we prevent another Tuskegee? April 18, 1979. Belmont Conference Center, Maryland. The National Commission released its final report, a document that would become known simply as the Belmont Report. It distilled the principles of Nuremberg and Helsinki into 3 core ethical requirements for all research involving human subjects. First, respect for persons. Individuals must be treated as autonomous agents capable of making informed decisions about their participation in research. Vulnerable populations, including children, prisoners, and the mentally incapacitated, must receive additional protections. Second, beneficence. Researchers must maximize benefits and minimize harms. The potential risks to participants must never exceed the anticipated benefits to society. Third, justice. The benefits and burdens of research must be distributed fairly. Researchers cannot exploit vulnerable populations for convenience while reserving the benefits of the research for the privileged. The Belmont Report concluded with a mandate. Every institution conducting federally funded research involving human subjects must establish an institutional review board, an independent committee empowered to review, approve, or reject research proposals based on ethical criteria. By 1991, IRBs were operating at every major university, hospital, and research center in the United States. By 2000, the model had spread globally, with ethics review committees required in over 80 countries. The line that Leo Alexander drew in 1947, separating medicine from murder, had become institutionalized, codified, and enforced across the world. But even as the ethical framework expanded, a troubling question resurfaced. What should be done with the data collected by Nazi doctors? November 1988, University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Dr. Arthur Kaplan, a bioethicist, received an email from Dr. Robert Pozos, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota Duluth and a nationally recognized expert on hypothermia. Pozos had spent years studying cold exposure in human subjects, funded by the U.S. Armed Forces and private companies with operations in extreme environments. But his research had a critical limitation. For ethical reasons, he could never expose his subjects to temperatures low enough to cause death or near death. Only the Nazis had done that. Pozos wrote to Kaplan, "I am studying the Nazi hypothermia data from Dachau. It contains information on 300 to 400 prisoners submerged in ice water tanks until 80 of them died. The data includes precise measurements of body temperature, time to unconsciousness, and methods of rewarming. This information could save lives of people rescued from freezing water after boat accidents. Should I use it?" Kaplan read the email twice, then responded immediately, "We need to talk. This is not a question I can answer in an email." Over the following months, Kaplan and Pozos organized a conference at the University of Minnesota to examine the ethical implications of using Nazi data. Survivors of the experiments were invited to testify, along with historians, ethicists, medical researchers, and representatives from Jewish organizations. Jadwiga Dido, now in her 70s, traveled from Poland to attend. She took the stage and addressed the assembled scholars. "I survived Ravensbrück. I carry the scars of Nazi experiments on my body every day. If you use their data, you legitimize what they did. You tell the world that the ends justified the means. You tell my friends who died that their suffering had value. It did not. It was murder, not science." Dr. Pozos stood to respond. "Ms. Zito, I understand your pain, but if we can save even one life with this data, doesn't that honor the memory of those who died? Zito's voice did not waver. No, it insults them. The only way to honor them is to say, clearly and forever, that this data is tainted beyond redemption. Science built on torture is not science. It is complicity. The conference concluded with a recommendation. Nazi medical data should not be used, cited, or republished, regardless of its potential scientific value. The New England Journal of Medicine rejected Pozos's proposal to publish the hypothermia data openly. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency rejected proposals to use Nazi phosgene gas exposure data, even though it could have informed safety regulations for workers accidentally exposed to toxic chemicals. In 1990, Dr. Robert Berger, a physiologist, published a comprehensive review of the Nazi hypothermia experiments in the New England Journal of Medicine. His conclusion was damning. The experiments were conducted with such methodological incompetence, bias, and cruelty that the data is scientifically worthless. Rascher's temperature logs were inconsistent, his rewarming protocols contradictory, and his conclusions not supported by his own measurements. The only thing the Nazi experiments proved is that torture masquerading as science produces nothing of value. The debate was settled. The legacy of Nazi medical crimes was not data. It was ethics. December 10, 2024. Geneva, Switzerland. 83 years after the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau, the World Medical Association convened to update the Declaration of Helsinki for the 11th time. The assembled delegates reaffirmed the principles established in Nuremberg, expanded in Helsinki, and institutionalized through the Belmont Report. The opening line remained unchanged. It is the mission of the physician to safeguard the health of humanity. But the document had evolved. New protections addressed digital health data, genetic research, artificial intelligence in clinical trials, and global health inequities. Yet every edition traced its lineage back to the same source. 10 principles written in 1947 by American medical officers and judges who looked at the horrors of Nazi experimentation and declared, "Never again." Today, every university, hospital, and research institution in the world operates under the ethical framework born from the Nuremberg trials. Institutional review boards review every study involving human subjects, ensuring informed consent, minimizing risks, and protecting vulnerable populations. Researchers who violate these principles face professional sanctions, legal prosecution, and career termination. The Declaration of Helsinki has been adopted by medical associations in over 100 countries. The Belmont Report governs all federally funded research in the United States. The International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use requires adherence to good clinical practice guidelines, all rooted in the Nuremberg Code. Informed consent forms required for every clinical trial and medical procedure trace their existence to Leo Alexander's insistence that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Every time a patient signs a consent form, every time a researcher submits a protocol for ethical review, every time a student learns the principles of medical ethics, the legacy of Nuremberg endures. April 11, 2025. Buchenwald Memorial, Weimar, Germany. 80 years to the day after American soldiers from the 6th Armored Division liberated Buchenwald, survivors gathered at the camp memorial for a final ceremony. Only a handful remained alive, all in their 90s, frail but resolute. Jadwiga Zito, now 102 years old, addressed the crowd in a wheelchair, her voice steady despite her age. "I came here to say thank you to the American soldiers who liberated us, to the American doctors who documented our suffering, to the American prosecutors who held our torturers accountable, and to the American judges who created the code that protects every human being on earth from what was done to us." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "When I testified at Nuremberg in 1947, I showed the judges my scarred leg and told them what the Nazi doctors did to me. I thought the trial was about punishment. I was wrong. It was about prevention. The Nuremberg Code did not bring back my friends who died, but it ensured that no doctor anywhere in the world could ever again claim that science justifies torture." She looked out at the assembled crowd. Holocaust survivors, medical students, ethicists, government officials, and descendants of the American soldiers who had liberated the camps 80 years earlier. The Nazi doctors believed they were beyond judgment. The American rescue teams proved them wrong. And the code they left behind is their greatest victory over the ideology that tried to destroy us. The crowd rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. As the ceremony concluded, a group of American medical students approached Zito and asked to photograph her scar. The same scar she had shown the judges at Nuremberg 78 years earlier. She lifted the hem of her dress once more, revealing the thick, jagged tissue running from her knee to her ankle. One student, tears streaming down her face, said, "Miss Zito, I learned about informed consent in my first week of medical school. I never knew where it came from. Now I do. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for testifying. Thank you for making sure we never forget." Zito smiled faintly and replied, "You're welcome. Now go and be the kind of doctor the world needs. Heal, do not harm. Ask, do not force. Remember, do not forget." That evening, as the sun set over Buchenwald, the American flag flew alongside the flags of the liberated nations. It was a symbol of the unbreakable truth that had emerged from the darkest chapter of the 20th century. When evil cloaked itself in the language of science and hid behind the authority of the state, it was American soldiers, investigators, prosecutors, and judges who exposed it, defeated it, and ensured it could never rise again. The Nazi SS camp doctors had believed they were invincible, protected by law and ideology. America's rescue teams crushed them with something far more powerful than vengeance: truth, justice, and an ethical standard that declared for all time that medicine exists to heal, that consent is sacred, and that no government, no war, and no ideology can ever justify treating human beings as expendable. The Nuremberg Code was not merely a legal document. It was a moral declaration written in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, a promise that the victims of Nazi medical crimes would not be forgotten, and a foundation upon which the entire edifice of modern medical ethics was built. And every day, in every hospital, clinic, and research laboratory across the world, that promise is kept.